100,000 soldiers appear outside the capital at dawn. They've crossed half a continent, and nobody asked what they ate on the way, who carried it, how a kingdom of farmers spared that many hands from the harvest, or what 100,000 mouths do to every village they pass. Then, the siege begins, the hero scales the wall, and overall it's a great scene. Except that anyone with some military understanding from real-world history watched the very first sentence fall apart, and stopped trusting the rest. That's the thing about warfare in fantasy. The part that breaks the spell almost never happens during the fighting. As a historian, I've studied these things for years, and today I'm fixing the most common war mistakes that quietly give the whole world away. So let's start with that opening image, because the mistake hiding in it is the one I see more than any other. And it comes down to one number: the size of the armies. They're too big, almost always, and usually by a lot. Here's the instinct that gets writers into trouble. You've got a sprawling kingdom, a desperate cause, a population of millions, so you reason that the king can raise this enormous host. 100,000, 200,000. The number's supposed to feel epic, and on the page, for a second, it does. The trouble is that the real limit on an army was never how many people could physically pick up a spear. It was something far less romantic than that. Paperwork. Think about what raising an army actually demands. Somebody has to find these people and pull them off the farms, which means somebody somewhere is keeping track of who owes service and who's already left. They all have to be armed and then fed every day on a schedule, while the whole mass of them is moving. That's not heroism, that's administration, and administration is exactly the thing most fantasy kingdoms quietly don't have. The historian Brett Devereaux, who writes about all this for Worldbuilders specifically, makes the point that in a world where something like 9 in 10 people are farming just to keep everyone fed, the supply of literate officials who could run a system like that is tiny. So big armies don't really come from big populations. They come from big bureaucracies. And once you know that, the real numbers stop sounding small and start sounding right. Agincourt, one of the most famous battles in English history, the one Shakespeare built a whole play around, was fought by something like 8,000 Englishmen. A full Roman field army, the war machine that conquered the Mediterranean, ran around 20,000 soldiers, with another 5,000 non-combatants trailing behind it just to keep the thing moving. A medieval kingdom going all out for a national campaign might scrape together 10 or 20,000. The squabbles we name entire wars after were often fought by 2,000 or 3,000 people aside, and the very biggest armies the ancient Mediterranean world could put in one place topped out somewhere near 80 to 100,000, and that was the ceiling, the absolute edge of what management and logistics could bear, not an average. A handful of giant bureaucratic empires like ancient China could field more, but that only proves the rule. The bigger the army, the bigger the state machine standing behind it. So here's the fix. And it's a quick gut check you can run on your own world right now. Don't size your army to how dramatic the number feels. Size it to what your state can realistically administer and feed. Take that backwater duchy that musters 150,000 troops overnight and shrink it. Give it 8,000. Now it's a real force, and suddenly every one of those soldiers matters. Every loss is felt, and a clever commander with 3,000 can plausibly outfight a careless one with 6. If you genuinely want a vast army, that's allowed. But understand, you've just told me your kingdom has a sprawling professional bureaucracy humming away behind it. So let me see that too. The number is a promise about the whole society underneath it. Because the moment you've got a believable number of soldiers standing in a field, you've inherited a much worse problem. Every single one of them is going to be hungry tomorrow morning. An army isn't really a number of soldiers. It's a city, a hungry one, that has to pack up and walk somewhere new every day. And cities, it turns out, are very hard to feed when they refuse to hold still. This is the single most important idea in the whole video. So let me make it concrete. You might assume a big kingdom solves the food problem the way a modern country would. Set up supply lines running back to the capital, ship the grain forward to wherever the army happens to be. It's the obvious answer. It also can't work. And the reason is almost funny once you see it. Anything that can carry food also eats food. The oxen pulling the heavy wagons graze the countryside bare just to keep moving. The horses and mules eat the grain itself, the very thing they're hauling. The drivers eat too. The further your supply line stretches, the more of itself it devours along the way, until past a certain distance the wagon shows up empty, eaten by the very train that was supposed to deliver it. So pre-modern armies couldn't truck their dinner across a continent. They carried maybe 2 weeks' worth, and after that they had to find it wherever they stood. Devereaux makes the point that foraging, or living off the land, is a very tidy, sanitized phrase for what was usually an ugly business. It meant stripping the food out of whatever villages happened to be in the path. Run the math even loosely and the picture gets vivid. A soldier eats roughly a kilo of grain a day. A warhorse eats about 5 times that, which is why a cavalry-heavy army is a logistical nightmare. Those gorgeous chargers are eating you straight out of the campaign. A herd of 1,000 cattle driven along as walking rations feeds maybe 14,000 people for about 10 days, and then it's gone. And the whole hungry city only manages 5 to 15 miles a day. Slower still if it has to spread out and forage hard. War, it turns out, is mostly walking, slowly, while eating. So here's where the fix gets genuinely fun, because food doesn't only make your world plausible, it hands you plot for free. Picture the flat version first. The army marched south to the enemy capital and laid siege. One sentence, nothing in it. Now rebuild it with what we just learned. Which route do they take? The short one through the mountains where there's nothing to eat, or the long one through the river valley where there is? And what becomes of those river valley villages after 50,000 mouths pass through? Somewhere out on that road, the army outruns its own supply and has to choose. Turn back or gamble everything on a fast victory before it starves. Suddenly the march isn't a boring transition between the real scenes. It is a scene. Some of the best conflict in your whole war can happen before anyone draws a sword. And honestly, if the part you're enjoying right now is the rhythm of it, first the broken thing, then exactly why it breaks, and finally the fix, that's the entire idea behind a free guide I put together called the Fantasy Writing Remedies. It's a diagnostic library. 40 of the most common writing problems, each one with what it actually looks like on the page and how to fix it. There's no sign up, it's just sitting in the description if you want it. Now zoom all the way in with me from the whole marching campaign down to the one event fantasy gets wrong more confidently than any other. The siege. Here's something that sounds backwards until you sit with it. In a lot of real sieges, the most dangerous place to be wasn't inside the walls. It was outside them, in the attacker's camp. Fantasy almost always writes the siege as an assault. Ladders go up, a ram hits the gate, the hero fights along the breach, and the castle falls in one glorious afternoon. And direct assaults did happen, but they were so costly that they were usually a last resort. The thing you tried when you'd run out of patience because hurling bodies at a fortified wall was a fantastic way to lose your army for nothing. Most sieges were won the slow way. Surround the place, cut it off, and wait for hunger and disease to do the work the walls wouldn't let your soldiers do. But, and this is the part that makes a siege genuinely tense instead of just a countdown for the people inside, the besieging army is on a clock too. It's parked in one spot in its own filth for weeks or months, which in the pre-modern world means sickness tearing through the camp. It's eating that same countryside we just talked about, and it already stripped the easy food on the way in. The soldiers might be levies who only owe a set number of days. Every week that castle holds is costing the attacker money, men, and time. Plenty of sieges ended with the attackers giving up, sick and starving, while the garrison watched them go from the walls. Whoever runs out first loses, and it isn't always the side behind the gate. There was even a custom that tells you everything about how these really worked. The two sides would strike a deal. If no relief army arrives by such and such a date, the garrison surrenders. There's no grand final battle. The whole thing hangs on a calendar and a question. Is anyone coming to save us? And will they make it in time? So take your flat siege. After weeks of brutal fighting, the army stormed the walls and took the castle. And throw out the storming. Build it back as a slow vice instead. The food on both sides ticking down. The deadline scratched into the agreement. Fever moving through the camp outside while the city inside counts its last sacks of grain. The real question stops being who's the better fighter. It becomes who breaks first. That's a climax with a pulse, and you didn't need a single ladder thrown at the walls. And notice what the Storm the Walls fantasy is really built on. The same quiet assumption that wrecks open battles too. The idea that a fight is a swarm of heroes, each hacking away on their own. Picture the standard fantasy battle. The two armies charge across the field, scream into each other, and the instant they collide, the whole thing dissolves into 1,000 private duels, every warrior picking a dance partner, the hero carving a lonely path through the chaos toward the enemy captain. It looks incredible. It's also almost exactly wrong, and it's wrong in a way that quietly tells a historian the writer never stopped to ask why people stood in lines. Because they did stand in lines almost everywhere they fought for thousands of years, and not because some general thought it looked tidy. They did it because the person next to you is the only reason you're alive. When you're shoulder to shoulder with your neighbors, an enemy can't reach your side without going through the man beside you, so you only have to worry about the threat in front of you. The second you peel off to go be a hero, You've got enemies on 3 sides and only 2 eyes. Devereaux puts the real point well. The protection of a formation is that each soldier threatens the space around their neighbors. You're not only defending yourself, your presence makes you dangerous to anyone trying to get at the person beside you. Step out of the line and you lose all of that at once. And here's a detail that surprises people, because the movies get this wrong in the other direction too. These formations weren't a crushed shield-on-shield scrum. Men needed room to actually fight. Each man in the line usually had something like 3 feet of space, sometimes more, close enough to cover each other, open enough to swing. The picture isn't sardines in a tin. It's a disciplined line with a little breathing room, holding its shape under pressure, so the fix flips where the drama lives. Stop writing the battle as a highlight reel of your hero's solo kills. Write it as the line holding, or not holding. The real tension in an ancient fight isn't, will the hero win his duel? It's, will the formation crack? Your hero's job in a real battle isn't to wander off monster hunting. It's to keep the terrified people on either side of them from running. And that's a more interesting kind of courage anyway. Not the freedom to fight alone, but the discipline to stay. This is really the thing sitting underneath all of these fixes. A war is one giant interlocking system, and so is everything else in your world. That's the whole reason I'm building a full course on it, the world building system. 10 modules that take you from a blank map to a story-ready world Bible, the same way of thinking applied to your geography, your cultures, your magic, all of it. It's a founder pre-order right now, ahead of the launch in August 2026, so if this is how you like to think about worlds, you can lock that in or just follow along for the launch. Now, if you've ever written a battle where 2 armies just grind each other down to almost nobody, here's the thing. Real battles almost never ended that way. So put yourself in the line for a second. You're packed in with your neighbors. It's louder than anything you've ever heard. You can see almost nothing past the men in front of you. And you have no idea how the battle as a whole is going. All you know is your little patch of it. And then the man beside you turns and runs. Then 2 more. And in about 4 seconds, before your brain even gets a vote, you run too. That, far more than any clever maneuver, is how battles actually ended. Fantasy writes the battle as a grinding mutual slaughter, both sides hacking away until only a heroic few are left standing. Real battles weren't like that. They were usually decided the moment one side's nerve gave out, and that came shockingly early. Armies tended to fall apart at or before losing about 1/10 of their number. 1/10. Not the last man, not even close to half. Once 1 in 10 was down and the line started to feel like it was losing, the whole thing could fold into a panic. And here's the fact that reorganizes everything. Most of the killing didn't happen during the fight. It happened after, in the rout, when one side broke and ran, and all those men suddenly weren't protecting each other anymore, weren't even facing the right way, just backs to be cut down by a pursuing enemy. The fighting was relatively survivable. The running was the slaughter. Which means the thing your battle scene should be obsessed with isn't how many did the hero kill. It's whose nerve breaks and when. That reframes what makes one army beat another too. It usually wasn't courage in some grand individual sense. It was cohesion. And cohesion comes from bonds. From standing beside people you actually know and won't abandon. Devereaux draws a sharp line between 2 forces. Morale, he says, gets men to the battle. But cohesion is what gets them through it. The army that holds is the one whose soldiers can't stand the thought of being the one who breaks faith with the man on their left. So when you write the turning point, don't tally the dead. Track the nerve. Show the flank that wavers, the rumor that the king has fallen, the green unit that bolts and drags the steadier one beside it along into the panic. And then put the real cost in the chase, not the clash. The lever you actually control as the world builder is the why. Why this army holds when that one runs. Who trained together, who's fighting for something they believe in, and who just got handed a spear this morning and pointed at an enemy they don't believe in fighting. And that helplessness, being stuck in a collapse you can feel but can't see the shape of, turns out to be the exact feeling of the one person fantasy assumes is in total control of all this. The general up on the hill. You see, there's one last fix, and it pulls all the others into focus, so stay with me. Often we picture the general as a kind of god above the battle, watching the whole field like a map, sliding units around in real time, countering the enemy move for move. It's the strategy game fantasy, and it's maybe the most forgivable mistake on this whole list, because that genuinely is how we experience battles in games and films. It's just not remotely how command worked. A pre-modern general's real power was almost all spent before the fighting ever started. He chose the ground. He decided how the army would line up, who'd hold the flanks, what the plan was, and how he thought it would win. And then the armies met, and he went nearly blind and nearly mute. Picture it. No radios, no telephones, just deafening noise and a line of men that could run for miles. His ways to send an order, a handful of signal flags and horns, his own voice, runners sprinting across a chaotic field, were all slow, ambiguous, or easily lost in the noise. And plenty of those messengers wouldn't make it, or would arrive too late to matter. The signaling was so limited that armies past a certain size simply couldn't be commanded as one thing at all. So give your general his brilliance up front in the plan and the placement, and then give him the fog. Some of the best fictional commanders are the ones stuck agonizing on that hill, watching it unfold, unable to do the thing every reader is screaming at them to do. Pull all of this together and you get one picture, the one underneath every fix in this video. An army is a hungry city that has to walk. A battle is settled by nerve, not by body count. And the people supposedly in charge are working half-blind the whole time, wrestling problems that have almost nothing to do with swordsmanship. Get that picture right, and your war stops feeling like a video game and starts feeling like something that could really happen to real people. But with that said, there's one more enemy I need to bring up again. The one fantasy almost never shows even though it killed more soldiers than every sword and arrow combined. Disease, camp fever, and dysentery. Thousands of people living packed together with no sanitation, and the sickness that always comes with it. For nearly all of history, far more soldiers died of illness than of the enemy. In the American Civil War, something like 2 out of every 3 military deaths came from sickness rather than combat. And even into the 1800s, you get armies losing tens of thousands to disease against a few thousand to actual wounds. Your war doesn't have to dwell on it, but if you want a campaign that feels real, the thing quietly thinning the ranks of an army was almost always sickness, not the enemy's champion. So here's the rewrite that uses everything. The flat version could be summarized as this. The army marched south, won a great battle, and took the kingdom. Now the real version grounded in history sounds like this. An army sized to what the realm can actually feed and govern sets out, and starts shedding men to fever before it ever lays eyes on the enemy. It eats the countryside as it goes, and has to reach the capital before it eats itself hollow. It can't simply storm the walls, so it settles in for a siege that's a slow contest of who starves first, a deadline ticking the whole time. When the field battle finally comes, it's decided in minutes. One wing's nerve breaks, the panic spreads, and the real killing happens in the chase. The general who won mostly chose well beforehand and then prayed his way through the noise. Same primary words defining the plot. They marched, they fought, and they won. But now there's a real and living foundation underneath that grounds the whole thing. Now, I already know what some of you might be thinking. It's fantasy. I have magic. None of these rules apply to me. You're right. And that's actually the most fun part. Magic is a cheat code, but it's a cheat code you have to use and explain too. If teleportation feeds your army, fantastic. Now tell me why the enemy isn't using it to drop soldiers behind your lines. If a spell cures the camp fever, great. Who pays for it? And what happens to the soldier who can't afford the healer? My point with this video was never about obeying history. Every real constraint you break just has to be replaced by a system you actually show me. Break a rule on purpose with your eyes open, and that's world building. Break it because you forgot the rule was even there, and that's the thing a historian feels in their gut on page 1. So get these right, and you're not just dodging mistakes. You're handing yourself some of the richest material in your entire story. The long march, the siege clock, the breaking line, the fever moving through the camp, that's where the real tension lives, and almost nobody is using it. But more often than not, before the war, there was politics. And to make sure your battles aren't happening for the wrong reasons, check out this video here next, where I break down the most common politics mistakes in fantasy.